So is there actual software to edit out the ums and the uhs from your podcast? We've got the answer coming up next. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Shanna Hernandez, radio broadcaster, podcaster, and podcast producer. And today we're talking about whether or not there is software to actually automatically edit out the ums and the uhs that you are saying inside of your podcast. And this is a question that in the podcasting world can become a little controversial depending on how you look at it, because there are podcasters and podcast editors that prefer that there are actually no ums and uhs. We call those filler words. So the ums and uhs would be called filler words, and there are a lot of podcasters that feel that those just are not necessary to have in a podcast, whereas there are other people who feel that you can kind of get away with having those filler words inside of your podcast because it's part of the natural language. And so I want to break that down for you today and help you determine whether or not you need to be editing out filler words for your podcast. So a quick story before I jump into today's topic is that every night when I get home from the radio station, I come home and I watch the late night TV show hosts like Stephen Colbert and Seth Meyers and James Corden, and they're all conducting interviews. And when you look at these interviews, all they are just podcast interviews on camera. We can all pretty much agree on that. And when you watch each one of these hosts conduct an interview, and when I say conduct an interview, I'm not talking about their monologue. I'm not talking about anything that is a skit. I'm talking about the actual interview itself. Those interviews are really done off of the cuff. And what you're hearing in those interviews are a lot of filler words. So it's going to give some context to what I'm about to tell you right now as to whether or not you should have filler words, or if you have too many filler words, what can you do to reduce the amount of filler words in maybe the post-production process or actually in the actual presentation of whatever you're doing. First, let's talk about what type of orator are you going to be? What type of speaker are you going to be? Are you going to be a speaker who is going to be speaking in your podcast in a more formal setting, or is it going to be in a more informal setting? This goes all the way back to our days in high school when we were taught about formal and informal speech. And you have to determine what that is going to be for your podcast. For the instance of what I'm doing and the sections of the podcast that I create, that I created about a year ago for my podcast, Be the Experience, parts of it were informal and scripted, where the interview parts were very informal. I wanted the audience to understand that I was coming up with questions off the cuff and being able to have the audience be a part of my interview. And there were going to be filler words that were in those interviews. So you need to really determine what type of podcast you're going to have. Is it going to be informal or is it going to be formal? You have to decipher that. Are parts of it going to be formal and other parts of it going to be informal? You can really play around with the space of podcasting because the entire podcast doesn't have to be all formal, or it doesn't have to be all informal. You can play with that space. That's why podcasting is such a free form piece of media that you could do whatever you want. It's not like traditional radio and it's not like traditional TV. You can play within those areas, but even when you look at radio and TV, they still are able to play within the areas of formal and informal speech. So in your first podcast, you probably may find out that you are saying and a lot, and it's going to frustrate you, and you feel as though that should not be included in your podcast because it makes you look dumb or it makes you look uninformed. And I want you to get that out of your head completely. Nothing makes you look dumb. Nothing makes you look uninformed, because if you are the one creating the podcast and you are the one that is sharing your knowledge and your expertise and your inspiration to the audience that is listening to you, they're going to look at you as the person who has the expertise, who is inspirational, who has that knowledge. And even if you are someone who doesn't know the answer in your field, it's completely okay, because podcasting and YouTubing and blogging all are a part of this idea that you can be as transparent as possible online because you're actually getting the real answers. So if you're if you're creating filler words in your podcast, it's going to be completely okay. Some people say that maybe too many ums and uhs are too annoying in the podcast, whereas some people say like, oh, if you're going to edit it out, it sounds too robotic. Let me share with you a couple of those examples. First, you have some podcasters and podcast editors out there that feel as though that every and pause and piece of dead air in the podcast must be eliminated. And this is really all going to be based around your philosophy as to how you see your podcast being edited and how you see the type of speech being communicated over the podcast itself. It's going to be up to you and your philosophy. What I'm showing you and what I'm teaching you is my philosophy. And my philosophy is that you don't have to edit out every and pause and pregnant pause. Those are parts of the natural speech patterns that we have as humans. And when you go and you start editing out every one of those pieces of ums and uhs, it really does, to me, a disservice to the podcast. And when the listener goes back and they listen, all they're hearing are these chopped up pieces of audio where you're not taking any breaths, you're not thinking any thoughts out, and it just sounds unnatural to me. Maybe different for you, but I prefer to have a conversation whether I'm talking to you on YouTube or I'm talking to you on a podcast. It's going to be up to your philosophy. However, I strongly believe that you don't have to edit out every one of those pieces of filler words and pauses, because you're going to be doing yourself the disservice and you're going to be spending far more time editing your podcast than spending the time creating the actual quality content that your audience is looking for. There are a lot of podcast editors out there who feel as though this is something they need to do. They need to edit out every and. And it's quite controversial, and there's going to be some out there that are going to hate me for saying this, and there are going to be some out there that are going to say, yeah, it makes sense. But just don't edit for the sake of editing to justify why you have to edit a podcast. Edit a podcast that is editing out ideas that didn't make sense for the interview or the podcast itself. Editing ums and uhs takes far too much time, and it'll waste so much time for you down the line that you're editing a podcast that's 30 minutes. It may take you 2 hours. It may take you 1 hour. It may take you 3 hours. You don't want to spend too much time editing out unnecessary things. I really want to try and drive that home for you, because that is the one thing that stifles a lot of people in their podcasting process. They feel they sound dumb. They feel they sound ignorant. They feel as though those are the pieces that just are going to keep them from sharing what really matters. So to answer the question, is there a software that removes automatically the ums and uhs? No, there isn't. There really isn't. There's nothing that will do that. This is really something that is all in your mind. It's you thinking that ums and uhs and pauses are something that are taboo and you need to stay away from them. I want you to get out of that mindset. I want you to put yourself in the mindset of sharing quality content. Now, when it comes down to the interview, or maybe it comes down to the actual process of recording your podcast, you may need to include a pause or something called a pregnant pause. And you've seen comedians do this many times, where they hold on a pause in order to get the laugh, or that's the payoff. And you can certainly do this inside of your podcast. The very last episode of my podcast, for that season of Be The Experience, I interviewed my friend Stephanie Peets, and she was telling the story about her boyfriend who had passed away. And she was recalling that last instance in which she had spoken with her boyfriend, Michael. And when she was talking to me, she paused, and her voice got very, very shaky. And she paused, and she was trying to get out the final words for that podcast. And there was this really long pregnant pause. And she paused, and she paused, and you could hear birds in the background, dogs barking, but you knew the emotion that was behind what she was trying to say. And I didn't want to edit that out, because that was what triggered the emotion for the listener to want to know what happened. So keeping those pregnant pauses adds to the story of your podcast. It doesn't matter whether or not it's an informational podcast or it's a storytelling podcast. Pauses are completely okay. Now, how do you reduce filler words if you can't edit them out automatically? Quite honestly, this is something that I think a lot of people who watch this channel need to understand, is that things that you do in your podcast are going to take practice. And it's going to take even more practice. And it's going to take more practice. And it's going to take more practice. And it's going to take more practice. You have to practice your craft over and over and over. When I first started this YouTube channel, I was completely afraid to get in front of the camera, because I didn't know whether or not I was going to be good in front of the camera. I had recorded plenty of other things for cameras, for the camera, for the radio station. Maybe it was for a course that I was teaching. But when it came to the YouTube portion, I was afraid of something that just didn't even exist. And it was the fear of just having my face shown. And recently I just did a survey and sent it out to my community, and I asked them, what was the thing that you feared the most about being in front of a camera? And they said, just by the way I look, or just by the way I sound. Those are mindset pieces that you should be getting out of your head and moving into the mindset that your expertise or your thoughts are what people are looking for. And when you practice getting in front of the camera, you practice getting in front of the microphone, and you're doing it over and over to where you reduce the filler words and you feel as though you can come in front of a camera and speak out what you know is true and what will help other people and what will enhance the world. You'll get used to it and find more confidence. Over and over and over, I have taken on many different hobbies and tasks, and every one of them took practice. And the only thing that will build your confidence to creating a better podcast over time is practice. You will go back and you'll look at your old podcast and you'll hear that you say and over and over. But then as you start getting into your later episodes, 12, 15, 20, 25, 35, you start to notice that you get a lot better at communicating your ideas. Another tip that you can use is by writing down bullet points of what you want to say. Right now, I actually have the blog for this video up on my website right now, and I am going back and I'm referring back to what I want to talk about in this video. One of those things that I want you to do is I want you to create a bullet point list of things that you want to talk about. You don't have to write out a script. You don't have to write out a long tirade because that takes a lot of time. But what you do know is that you know that topic better than anyone else if you've done your research. So write out bullet points as opposed to writing out blog style content to read on your podcast. It'll sound much more natural. It'll sound as though you are talking a little more in a conversational tone. It will take practice though. But write out bullet points instead of full scripts because that's going to save you time. A third step that you can utilize when it comes down to reducing the amount of filler words in your podcast is research your topic. Know your topic the best that you can. Most people who are doing a podcast are doing 1 or 2 a week. And it may take them the entire week to research, or it may take them a couple days to research. But what they're doing is they're researching that topic and writing down questions that they may want to ask, or writing down bullet points of things they want to talk about. A fourth step that you may want to take with you is you need to learn how to pace yourself. All the time I get ahead of myself on the radio. Sometimes I do it here on YouTube, and I get ahead of myself and I don't know what to say. But what I've had to learn to do is to pace myself, but also learn how to regulate my speech. Learn how to draw out words while in my mind thinking of the next thought that I want to say when I'm looking at the camera or when I'm talking into a microphone. I'm learning how to draw out words. As you see right there, I used that long draw out that word so that I can think about my next thought when it comes down to recording to YouTube. So learn this technique and this practice of drawing out words. It's all about the inflection of your voice. It's about using your voice and being confident in using your diaphragm and speaking from your diaphragm out into the microphone. You should learn how to harness that skill that you are now creating by drawing out the inflections of words and thinking ahead of time by using the notes that are in front of you. These are just things that are very simple, but most people don't utilize. So if you like this video, go ahead and leave it a thumbs up. And of course, if you're on YouTube, subscribe to my channel, and there's plenty of other videos that you can go ahead and check out that all relate to podcasting. Most of them are all about podcasting. That's what I want this channel to be all about so that I can help support you, the podcaster. And if you missed my video last week on branded leaks, you can find that over here on your right-hand side of the screen. And you can check out how you can utilize branded leaks for your podcast before you even get started and why it's so beneficial and useful when you start your podcast. In the meantime, thank you so much. Leave a comment down below if you have any questions. I'd love to hear your feedback. As usual, I get back as soon as possible. We'll see you next time.